Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Melons FAQ. This time we're going to be talking about suspension and generally how to set up a suspension setup in the most ideal way possible. To begin with, I want to explain a couple of simple concepts about how a suspension system will work. Clarify some things. To start with, I want to talk about the general shape of your average racing type coilovers or McPherson struts. The most important part to know about this is that the shock absorbers, as they're sometimes called, are not actually shock absorbers. They are, however, dampers, which means they dampen the oscillations of the spring when the spring absorbs the shock. So to say anything other than damper when you're talking about the shock absorbers is technically incorrect, because the spring is the thing that limits the basically the travel of the shock absorbers to prevent the shock absorbers, as they are, or dampers, from bottoming out. Because the shock absorbers or dampers, whichever one you want to call them, I prefer the term damper, cannot simply hold the car up on their own, because the weight of the car will actually cause the dampers to compress unless there's a spring that's there with them. Because the spring's job is to hold that pressure against the chassis or the frame of the car in order to ensure that the dampers are not compressed. The idea behind the spring is to absorb all of the impacts. However, spring will do what springs do. They will compress and they will spring back. The problem with having a spring that springs back like that is that that produces oscillations where the suspension will continue to bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce for literally minutes on end if there's no shock absorber. Because the shock absorber or damper is designed to dampen the oscillations of the spring. And then you've got, in the corners, when you're turning, that spring will be compressed, and then when you stop turning, it's going to straighten out, it's going to bounce, unless there's a damper. So you've got a rebound and a bump sort of settings on your damper, or a fast and a slow rebound type system, where you can control how the shock absorber or damper will actually return to its original position and continue to support the car without bouncing around like too much. The dampers will do different jobs at different rates depending on essentially how many valves there are within it and how the valves are opened and closed. In the case of the valves on a World Touring Car Championship car like this, the WTTC car will actually have valves in it which is intended to separate the sort of body roll and slow speed thing from the impact with the big bump. So when I hit that bump on the outside curb there, the dampers and the shock absorbers are going to help the springs to absorb that impact and then set the car back down onto four wheels without bouncing too much. but you'll see that I've got the dampers set a little bit too stiff for hitting the bumps too hard, that the car will bounce still a little bit on some of the harder bumps. And that's kind of okay. It's not ideal in some cases if you have to use the curb. But on a smoother track, it can be good in order to have that turn in and that bite and so on, that you don't have the body roll, so sometimes the car will switch directions quickly. And that's important for this section up here, which is one of the most important sections of the track, because you're full throttle to this corner. As long as you can just get the car to turn. I'm struggling right now, and I don't know why the setup isn't behaving the way that I set it. And you've got that turn just full throttle over the crest here, and you turn in over the crest, and you're trying to be full throttle there, but I missed my apex and I wasn't going to be able to full throttle there. And you've got this section here where the car is always going to bounce a little bit because the road drops away at such a rate that it's not a smooth track there. The track is very bumpy there. But the slow or the bump rebound is generally more to do with the body roll, and then the fast rebound is going to be when you hit a bump. That's what's going to control the car over the bumps in the corners. But essentially the springs, when you change the spring rate, you're just changing the amount of compression that you have over the bumps that way. And then you've got the dampers, which control the rate of oscillations of the spring, because you don't want to have too many oscillations. You're literally going to have wheels hopping, and that's going to reduce the amount of grip that you have available. The idea behind setting up a suspension system is to have the tires always in contact with the road without too much, let's say, body roll or anything along the lines of something like that, or without too much wheel hop. Anybody who's ever tried to drive an old Volvo 850 Estate with blown shock absorbers will tell you that's a bumpy ride. That is a very, very bumpy ride. And it's not bumpy because the suspension is too firm, but rather quite the opposite. The dampers don't dampen. So you've got just endless amount of suspension oscillations from the springs. And those suspension oscillations are going to actually cause the tires to lose grip when they leave the racing surface. And that's a good example right through there of how a car should behave over bumps, that it should still be somewhat smooth. You've got big body roll, big compression there because there's so much grip at that corner because of the banking of it, and because the fact that the apex of it compresses a little bit, that the tires have so much grip that they will cause more body roll in that corner at Forest Elbow than elsewhere on the track. Right here you've got almost no body roll. Brake down here you've got maybe some brake squat, and then no body roll because you're not turning that hard. The body roll comes when you're turning really hard. This car barely has any body roll because of the suspension setup that it has, but essentially the dampers and spring rates should be set according to each other so that the dampers aren't trying to do the spring's job and the spring isn't trying to do the dampers job. Because if anything is set wrong within the suspension, you're either going to have hopping or you're going to have body roll. And neither of those is good in terms of a race car suspension setup. But the springs and dampers and so on, if you're trying to make a more comfortable ride for your street car, you should actually use a soft suspension with a soft spring rate, and relatively firm dampers, but not overly firm. You just want to make sure that you're not having oscillations, which will cause more of a boat type steering. But you want to have a spring rate which is stiff enough that you're not bottoming out, but soft enough that you're not having a very harsh ride. And I think a lot of times when somebody's talking about like testing their car at the Nürburgring or whatever, they're trying to find that nice balance where you can have the car at a sporty setting and a comfortable setting and so on, all while testing at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, as the manufacturers do. So it's important to consider when you're setting up a suspension what sort of a balance you're looking for. Are you looking for a balanced front to rear that's a little bit changed from factory, where maybe you've got a front heavy car but you want to have lift off oversteer? Stiffen the rear suspension a little bit more than the front suspension. But make sure that you aren't going to have it being too many bumps, too many oscillations, because your shock absorbers, dampers, are being too stiff that they're not actually dampening the oscillations of the springs. Check your spring rate to make sure that your spring rate is not going to have things like bottoming out or anything like that going on. Check that your dampers aren't going to be too soft that you're going to have sort of like a bouncy type ride, where just recently a friend of mine had a Hyundai Accent. We were attempting to essentially set up the suspension for sort of a street and track use, but the rear shock absorbers, we didn't realize the rear shock absorbers are dampers. Either term is fine technically, but dampers is more correct. The dampers weren't set right. They were set way too soft and the spring rate was set way too stiff. The car was bouncing a lot, and I drove behind that Accent in my own car, and I realized, wow, that car has a lot of what's called ricer bounce, which is basically when you've got cut springs, which are not capable of fully supporting the load of the car, and then you've got no shock absorbers or blown shock absorbers underneath that. And I said, whoa, we have to work on that rear suspension, because that's not even safe. Have that much bounce that the rear wheels are leaving the ground a little bit when you hit bumps. And so we worked on it. We stiffened up the dampers, and we, I think, softened up the spring rate a bit, or left the spring rate the same. And now the car handles much, much better, to the point that it will out-handle just about any car on the road, even with only 175 wide tires. Simply because we set it up with the suspension setup, which is very similar to the suspension setup in this Citroën Champs-Élysées. But this Citroën Champs-Élysées, I stiffened the rear up even more than I did with the Accent, simply because the purpose of this vehicle is a pure race car, and it has to run like the fastest possible lap times without any concern for tire wear or safety or the amount of trust that I have when I'm trying to drive this car, that I'm not going to have lift-off oversteer at an inopportune moment when I'm driving on the road. And essentially, having that lift-off oversteer on the road is probably not a safe idea, but having it at the track is kind of okay. When you're having that in a sim racing game, then it's really fun and really fast, and there's no downside except for the fact that you might possibly crash. But again, it's a sim racing game though, so it doesn't really matter if you're going to crash or not, but essentially to set up a car, you have to match the spring rates and the damper rates together to where the car doesn't bounce. When that car landed, it only bounced like 1.5 times there, and that's really good for racing type setup. Your average Honda CR-V, for example, if it had done that, it would have been much, much, much softer in terms of the landing being less jarring, then it would have bounced maybe 4 or 5 times. And that's just because the dampers on the Honda CR-V are going to be so much softer that the result is going to be, as you imagine it, a much bouncier but softer, more comfortable ride. Where this car, when I hit a curb, it sort of doesn't bounce much, but what does happen is that it's very stiff. It's very sort of jarring ride. It's not very great for comfort, I should say. So when you're setting up your shock absorbers and dampers, that's your outright goal, is to match everything out to the point that everything will be nice and smooth and perfect. Damn, Gabriele Tarquini actually got 3rd place there for his Team Honda there. It's not a 1-2-3 for Citroën, but the idea behind trying to find that perfect setup is that every change that you do to the suspension is going to change the balance of the car between the understeer, neutral, and oversteer, and it's going to change the way that the car will behave over bumps. It will behave differently when you come over a crest, because the softer suspension is better when you're going to have a huge crest. You want to keep that the suspension somewhat softer when you're coming over a crest, so that it doesn't actually like stay up and then slowly come down and slowly come up, where it's more of a stiff setup with the stiffer damper. But instead you're going to have a softer suspension setup, which is going to more freely allow the suspension to travel up and down. When you're going over crests, you want that so that the tire will stay in contact more readily, and it will be less of a jump but more of a sort of crest that's not going to affect the handling quite as much. Rally cars, if you think of rally cars, they've got ultra soft suspension because they have to soak up the bump but keep the tires in contact. Street cars, a lot of times they've got soft suspension for comfort reasons. Race cars, a lot of times they're going to have very, very, very stiff suspension because they have to support the car, which is actually going to weigh a lot more than the street car after downforce is factored in. And on top of that, sometimes if you have like a front wheel drive race car, for example, a lot of the teams will run a very stiff rear suspension to the point that the rear tires aren't in contact with the road because of the size of the rear sway bar, which, by the way, the sway bar, since I forgot to mention that before, that is tying the left shock absorber and damper and the right dampers in together as one, so that the damper, when it compresses on the one side, it will push up against the other one. It'll actually compress that side suspension as well, even though that side is unloaded, but you're loading it with a sway bar. The stabilizer bar or anti-roll bar or sway bar, it's all the same thing. In a case of something like this, you're going to see throughout the race a couple of points where perhaps the rear suspension or front suspension or so on is too stiff, that it's stiffer than it should be. Over the bump there, Mach-Swing, his suspension was a little bit too stiff in that it didn't sort of, how do I say, remain supple over that crest. Coming over the crest there, it's got a little bit loose because the rear tire wasn't in good contact with the road at that point because the suspension wasn't supple enough. But because that's just a straightaway with reasonably high downforce, then it wasn't that important. But essentially, you might watch some of these corners here where the cars are going to be unsettled by a bump or anything similar to that because the shock absorbers and dampers aren't doing their job perfectly. Each part of the car has a dedicated purpose, if you will. That dedicated purpose has to be understood and utilized to its benefit. If you are going to try to build a race car, you want to have the suspension being supple enough that it will remain in good contact with the road over bumps and so on, but you want to have it stiff enough that it doesn't have the body roll. But a lot of times people will use shock absorbers, for example, to stiffen the ride quality where a sway bar should do the job. Or people will use the springs to try to do the damper's job, and they wonder, why is my car bouncing? I've stiffened up the springs a lot, it shouldn't bounce anymore. That's the damper's job. The springs are actually doing their job perfectly because they're bouncing. That's what springs do. You compress it and it comes back up. You compress it and it comes back up. You compress it and it comes back up. Tensile steel of springs is a different type of system than a gas-filled or liquid-filled shock absorber damper system, which the intent and purpose of each of those objects is an entirely different thing that has to be understood and accounted for. And when a car is being built, that's how that should work, though. If ever you watch a rally car going over a bump, the rally car suspension, you can see when it's in the air, has actually a couple of feet of travel. It's like a foot or two of travel, but because it's so soft, the car settles down, and the chassis of the car makes the suspension only have maybe 1.2 feet of travel, which it's intentional because they don't want to have the ride height too high to the point that the car has unnecessary ground clearance, that it's less stable at high speeds when you're coming over crests and jumps and so on. But then it's not so small that you're bottoming the car out and scraping the ground and blowing shock absorbers like crazy, because you have to have that fine balance with the ride height being set to where it needs to be so that the car doesn't hit the ground, doesn't bottom out, but that it still has the travel, the suspension function that it would have for absorbing the bumps that you will come across on a rally stage or on a racetrack. There's just a massive size difference in the bumps and the jumps and the crests and so on that you see between rally, where you've got cars that are flying around 40 feet in the air, and you've got tarmac where it's relatively smooth. I'm not going to say that it's like completely smooth because you've got turns like this one here, Skyline Bend, which really makes a huge difference, if you will. There's bumps that are there and they affect the suspension, travel, and everything a lot, but it's not to the same extent. But the fastest suspension setup is always the one that's at the perfect stiffness, with the perfect rebound, with the perfect sway bar setting. It all works together as a package, and that's sometimes people get that wrong. People try to use one thing, the spring rate, to do the damper's job or to do the sway bar's job. If you're having a huge body roll, you need to look at two things. Is your ride height excessive? Like, are you trying to make a Jeep go around a corner? Because that's probably not going to work very well. Jeeps are going to have the soft suspension, it's going to be compressed and everything. It's not ideal. Simply because the ride height is so high and the suspension is so soft that you're always going to have a bit of body roll, despite the relatively large stabilizer bars that are on the Jeeps. That you can try to keep it somewhat planted on the ground, but it's just not going to happen. They typically lift the inside tires because of just how much body roll they have and the center of gravity of it. Then you've got a car which is maybe more like a Ferrari F40, which is ultra low to the ground and doesn't have a very high center of gravity. It's a very low center of gravity. It's a small car that's very low to the ground, and it generates a reasonable amount of downforce to keep it further on the ground, where the suspension has to be stiff in order to fight that downforce to make sure that the car isn't going to slowly sort of drive itself into the ground at high speeds, because the downforce is pushing and applying more it's essentially more weight, but it's not weight that acts upon the car in terms of inertia, but it's weight in terms of acting on the car in terms of pressing the car into the road. You have to have the spring rates a little bit stiffer in order to keep that Ferrari F40 from bottoming out, as it were, from the high downforce setup. But if you set that suspension up that way that it's stiffer to keep it from bottoming out, then you're going to have it being less stable over bumps. Now, a lot of people, they might say that that means there's not going to be much body roll, and they put a soft sway bar on that car. It's not as big of a sway bar as you would see on something more like I want to say a Ford Transit van, for example, because something like that, it's so top heavy and it's got such ground clearance that there's going to be a lot of body roll. So the game has glitched out pretty badly, and I am relatively sorry for the oddball video footage that you just had there. Switching views to avoid having that again. A lot of times you have stiffer suspension for the purpose of keeping the car out of the ground or reducing body roll. Sway bars and so on are very effective in limiting body roll in a straight line, and in corners, but not under braking and acceleration, because you can't use a sway bar to try to eliminate essentially brake dive or brake squat, where this car doesn't have too much brake squat, but that's because its suspension is really stiff. If you look at some other cars, again, going back to the idea of it being a Jeep or so on, then the Jeep is going to have huge brake squat because it's a top-heavy car with soft suspension. And not even the sway bars are going to do anything about that to eliminate that, because the sway bar is determined to eliminate cornering body roll. But body roll in a forward to backward sort of longitudinal acceleration, I think it is, will be not ideal, because that sway bar isn't going to do anything to prevent that. And that's a lot of times also why people will run with stiffer suspensions. But sometimes brake squat can actually be a good thing, because you want to load the weight onto the front tires, but you can't overload them. You're using the suspension to transfer some more of the weight to the back when you stiffen the suspension for braking, for eliminating brake squat or brake dive. So when you have the brake squat, you want to have the suspension being rather firm, because you want to transfer some of that braking force to the rear tires. But then if you put too much to the back wheels, then the front tires will be overloaded, because the tires are going to be the ones that are doing the loading instead of the suspension. The softer the suspension is, the more supple it is, the more grip that corner will have, but the less sporty it'll be in terms of more body roll, more brake dive, more brake squat, more accelerating squat. Like, the car won't be as precise. It'll have more grip overall in terms of being safer and easier to control and easier to drive, but it's not going to be ideal in terms of setting a good lap, because the car is going to have too much grip. And I think that's something that a lot of people need to consider, is that when you stiffen the suspension, you're reducing grip overall, but you're trading that off in order to reduce body roll and so on, where the car will be more agile, to say. So if you compare a car with 2,000 pounds per square inch of spring rate force, and that's, I think, rather excessive, but it's a possibility that it's rather stiff, and then you compare it to one that's maybe 400 pounds per square inch on the spring rate, then the one that's going to have the 400, that will be more supple and forgiving over bumps, but it's not going to be as agile, that the car will take longer to change direction. Minus the fact that you're probably going to overload the tires with the 2,000 pounds per square inch. And yes, I did do that to show off, but I think the purpose there to show that the springs are very stiff and that they didn't absorb that shock, but rather the shock pushed the car into the air. That kind of goes to show that suspension and setup is a big deal within racing, because there are some cars that actually could have gotten away with that without even lifting the tire off of the ground. Like, I know rally cars that they'd just absorb it and the inside of the car would stay on the ground because the suspension travel would absorb that. But this isn't exactly a rally car, so doing something like that causes the whole chassis of the car to lift off of the ground, and then it sort of teeters because of the inertia. That one of the things with the inertia is that that car was going up and gravity is trying to pull it down, but the cornering force is sort of aiding the inertia that's trying to pull it up, because the tires have so much grip that it's going to do that. All told, it's just one of those things that you really have to pay attention to and really consider how your suspension is going to react to various things. very important to consider that when you're building a suspension setup for a race car or for a street car. How do you want your car to behave? Because your car will be a much safer, easier to drive car when the suspension is soft, but it's not going to be nearly as sporty when the suspension is soft. It's not going to change direction very quickly. It's going to sort of lumber through the corners. It's not going to be quick, simply because of the body roll and the poor behavior, where it's not going to be tight and crisp, or you can put a really big sway bar, in which case the car is going to switch directions a little bit more quickly, but it's kind of going to be a little bit sketchy because you're going to be on, in some cases, only 3 wheels. Anyways, that's all for me. Hope you've learned something from this, and have a good day.
Just don't know what I'm supposed to do.